Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll take a few minutes of your time to introduce my forthcoming book, which is entitled Democratic Criticism, Poetics of Incitement and the Muslim Sacred. Now, this book will probably be published next year by Lever Press. And yeah, it's not a very well-known press, but let me first share with you who are the people at Lever Press. Now, Lever Press was launched by about 50 liberal arts colleges in the United States. Each one of them pooled a certain amount of money, and they pooled it together to create an open access, born digital academic press. The idea behind it was to publish quality books, academic books, dealing with teaching, but also literary studies and cultural studies and humanities in general, but books that are first published in the digital format and are published as open access books. So I heard of this press through my mentor, Dr. Robin Goodman, who was the first one to publish her book, Promissory Notes, with Lever Press. So hence, I proposed this particular book to Lever Press. Now, my most important reason in proposing this book to Lever Press was not necessarily their mission, but also my own hope that more and more people should be able to read this book, especially people from the Islamic world, where sometimes books can be highly expensive and not even available, right? The print versions. So that's why I looked for an open access press and then pitched my book to Lever Press. Now, let me tell you, it is an open access press, but this was not a cakewalk for me. I mean, the book went through 3 stages of review, 3 different review processes. That means 6 people reviewed it, and I had to revise it 3 times. And I think that made the book better. So that's the process, that's the book, and the press with which it will be published. And when it comes out, of course, I will share the link and you can freely read it online and even download it. Now, what is this book about? Well, what I tried to answer in this book, the question that I tried to answer was the debate between absolute freedom of expression and the reader's right to say, this is offensive to me, this hurts my feelings. These are the 2 extremes of representation, right? The authorial claim that me, the author, has the right to say whatever I want to say, especially in a work of fiction, and the reader coming to the act of reading and then saying, this hurts my feelings, this is offensive to me. And so the example for me was, the beginning point was the Rushdie affair, the publication of the Satanic Verses. And what I noticed as I did my research on Rushdie and on the publication of the Satanic Verses and what came to be known as the Rushdie affair, later the protests in the Muslim world, that there was a certain way the responses, even the peaceful protest by Muslim readers and Muslim respondents, were being represented in the Western media. They were being represented as atavistic, as ill-informed. You know, people were trying to tell them, well, if you read the book carefully, maybe you will read it differently. So the assumptions were that in order for an average Muslim reader to understand the Satanic Verses, they had to leave their own givens of their life, their own meaning-making processes, learn the specialized meaning-making processes of Western academy especially, but also Western general reading practices, then inhabit that space so that they could read the book and not feel angry, offended, or hurt by it. And I found that a very imperial attitude, which not many scholars had challenged. I mean, Said talks about it a little bit in the aftermath of the Rushdie affair. So I took that as the beginning point. So my purpose in the book was to first claim and suggest that if we are going to teach texts about Islam or Islamic cultures or Islamic history in our classrooms, let's say in English departments, we can't just teach them in a way where we only use purely Western modes of meaning making, interpretation, and understanding. We will have to develop, as professors and students, certain basic knowledges about how people receive texts in the Muslim world. What are their meaning making processes? So that we can at least attempt to understand their anguish, right? When a book like Satanic Verses is published. We may not agree with them, but at least understand it. Because if we are humanists, that's the least we should be able to do. Instead of saying, read it like us and you will enjoy it too, right? So that was the purpose of the book. Now the organization is pretty simple. I gave an introduction of the Rushdie affair and what I call Poetics of Incitement. Poetics of Incitement for me is the kind of texts that are produced primarily in Europe or United States, which intentionally try to touch upon certain very serious aspects of Islamic life and Islamic history, knowing that they will cause, a controversy or maybe hurt people's feelings. So that is what I'm calling a Poetics of Incitement. So in the first chapter, I kind of describe my understanding of the Muslim sacred, not necessarily the religion, but how average Muslims view the figure of the Prophet or the early Islamic history. What is their level of tolerance towards insult to these figures, right? Or insulting language to these figures. In the second chapter, I theorize and discuss what kind of a reader would it take here in the Western Academy to really make sense of what's going on when Muslims respond to certain texts and protests against them. And that chapter title is, of course, The Democratic Reader. Now, an important aside is that the first part of the title of the book, Democratic Criticism, comes from Edward Said's last book, which was published posthumously, which was called Democratic Criticism. So the title comes from there. Then I go into a discussion of a book chapter that Salman Rushdie himself has published and then later published in his collection Imaginary Homelands, where he tries to instruct the Muslims to read differently in order to really understand what he's trying to do in the Satanic Verses, which I also found slightly imperialistic, and that chapter deals with that issue. Then there is another chapter which deals with other works that have been published in the same vein, like The Jewel of Medina, a novel, and others. And then I go on to describe how Muslim reformers and writers have challenged the orthodoxies from within the Muslim tradition itself. And I discuss Fatima Marnisi's Women and Islam and an 1898 text in Urdu from the subcontinent by Maulana Mumtaz Ali, which is about the rights of women. And in order to prove that the Muslim world, as vast as it is not a world of uncritical, obedient beings. There are dissenting voices. There are people discussing the very sacred things, right, that might be considered taboo elsewhere and all. And then I included two of my previously published articles, one on the Satanic Verses, which was published in South Asia Journal, and they were grateful enough to give me the permission to publish it. And then also a chapter I had published on the Taliban. And the idea is, okay, here is stereotypical understanding of the Taliban, but here is how we can also think about them differently, within the neoliberal regime. How do they emerge and all. And then towards the end of the book, I discuss, our responsibility as readers and professors of literature, and how the two registers of recognition and redistribution play a role in our understanding of general literary texts, but also of the Muslim texts. So overall, the book doesn't give you any conclusive answers. None of my books does. But it launches a discussion of this very sensitive topic, the freedom of expression and the reader's right to feel the way they feel when they read a text, and the denial of that being not acceptable, right? So, and towards the end, I also encourage the Muslim readers and the Muslim respondents to these works to develop a slightly broader way of looking at things. Things are not always black and white, right? So what I think the book does is it will make a lot of people unhappy, because I don't stand with one constituency or the other, right? The liberal, progressive writers over here will question my assumptions about freedom of expression. And of course, the Muslim readers would say I'm not Muslim enough, right? But that was the project of the book, to place myself somewhere in the middle where I can pull strings from both extremes and say, can we develop a workable discourse, a workable praxis where we can take into account the feelings of the reader and the right of the author to express themselves freely and openly, and come together to a point where we can develop a discourse and a praxis that is sensitive to the reader's way of receiving the text, the Muslim reader's way of receiving the text. Now, as you read it, you will see it's a different book. It is an academic book, but it doesn't come across as academic. There's a lot of me in it. It's also a book that makes fun of the author himself, right? Calls into questions my own assumptions. And it's a book that is also written in a narrative style. So that means part of it is a creative work. And I think that's what the reviewers liked the most, because most of the reviewers who reviewed the book before it was accepted for publication mentioned that the voice is what that keeps it together. Maybe it was intentional. I don't think so. I think the subject was so close to my heart, so dear to my heart, that I could not restrain inserting my own voice throughout the book, right? And so you will notice that. I'm not saying it's a perfect book. I'm not saying it's an all-exhaustive book. No, it's, another imperfect attempt that all of us scholars do. And probably the last book that I will publish as a formal scholar employed at a university, my last academic work in that sense. So I thought I should take a few moments to introduce it. I will post the links to the Lever Press website in the description. Keep an eye out for the book, and I will, of course, announce when it comes out. And I would love to hear your views about it when it comes out, but I would also love for you to share it with others and let your friends and family and everyone know that Masood Raja has written another crazy book and it should be coming out soon. So once again, the title is Democratic Criticism, Poetics of Incitement and the Muslim Sacred. And the book is now in production, and hopefully my hope is that it will be published either by the end of this year, but latest by the beginning of next year. So Hope you read it and let me know what you feel about it. Thank you so much for your time, for your patience. As you can see, I'm in my new office in Wheeling, West Virginia, where we have moved, and I'm still trying to figure out the backdrop and everything else. But this is where most of my future work will be produced and shared with you from here, from this small office in our house in Wheeling, West Virginia. I hope you're doing well and taking care of each other. Please be generous, be kind to each other, and, take care of each other and take care of yourself as well. I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, peace and love.